This is the start of the collapse of World Trade Center No. 1, also known as the North Tower. We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building. This may seem counterintuitive to you. You might think a falling block coming down on the lower section of the building would exert a greater force than a stationary block. But that is true only if the falling block actually impacts the lower block, which would cause the falling block to decelerate. The only way the falling block can continue to accelerate smoothly, as we see here, is for the lower section of the building to give way without significant resistance. If this rate of acceleration continued all the way to the ground, the building would fall in about 11.5 seconds. This is close to the observed collapse time. So far I've been using the term block loosely. What we actually see here is the falling section of the building turning to dust before our eyes. But what is happening to the upper section of the building behind the dust clouds doesn't really affect this analysis. Given the fact that it is accelerating downward, the top section of the building, whatever its condition, cannot possibly be destroying the lower section of the building. The destruction of the building must be caused by something else.
Building 3, a 22-story building directly below the Twin Towers, was split in half by the South Tower's collapse. Although the building was severely crushed by falling debris, the structure remained standing. Building 4, a 9-story building east of the South Tower, was almost completely destroyed. The remaining structure did not collapse. Building 5, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, suffered from severe fires and structural damage. Building 6, an 8-story building between the North Tower and Building 7, suffered a giant gouge in its roof and severe fires. Neither Building 5 or 6 suffered global collapse. Neither did the Deutsche Bank building, which stands to this day and is currently being demolished beam by beam. Neither did the Millennium Hotel across the street. Building 7 burns over a number of floors and suffers structural damage to its south face before collapsing completely to the ground. Did anything occur inside the building that might cause a collapse?
Right now. You gotta get back from here. You know that. You gotta get back.
All right. Don't worry about me. You need to make calls right now.
So, we have a 47-story steel-framed skyscraper, which housed various government agencies and numerous important documents, damaged less than the other World Trade Center buildings. At 5:20 p.m., all structural elements inside Building 7 simultaneously fail, and it collapses symmetrically, imploding into a pile of rubble. This building had 81 columns, 24 core and 57 perimeter, running from the basement to the roof. For the building to have collapsed the way it did, all 81 of these columns had to collapse simultaneously. Could fires on a few floors have heated up all these columns to the breaking point at the same time?
Alex, I was thinking this morning, I'm going, you know, I haven't seen a controlled demolition for a while, but I bet they're using the new method that only takes 6 hours. Just light a few strategically placed fires under the steel beams, and the building miraculously comes down into its footprint in 6.2 seconds. Why spend weeks putting explosives all over the building, making calculations, getting the triggers right, doing this, doing that? Why spend weeks when you could just spend a few hours lighting a couple of fires, and you can bring down a 47-story building in 6 seconds? So there must be this method being used, don't you think, Alex?
I'm convinced, yeah, there's a new way to demolish buildings. I hadn't thought of it from that way.
Because at 9:30 this morning, we were actually running an exercise for over a company of 1,000 people in London, based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations that happened this morning. So I still have the hairs on the back of my neck standing upright.
To get this quite straight, you were running an exercise to see how you would cope with this, and it happened while you were running the exercise?
Precisely.
I want to ask a question, Dominic. I don't care if you answer me or not. I just want to say this aloud. But I need to know that this question will not leave this office.
Yeah, of course, Inspector. But because of the terrorist?
No.
So what is it, Chief? What's going on?
The question I want to ask is about St. Mary's and Three Waters. The question that's kept me up for the last 24 hours, the question I have to ask is, what if the worst, the most horrifying biological attack in this country's history was not the work of religious extremists?
Well, I don't understand. We know it was. They were caught. They confessed.
And they were executed, I know. And maybe that's really what happened. But I see this chain of events, these coincidences, and I have to ask, what if that isn't what happened? What if someone else unleashed that virus? What if someone else killed all those people? Would you really want to know who it was?
Sure.
Even if it was someone working for this government? That's my question. If our own government was responsible for what happened at St. Mary's and Three Waters, if our own government was responsible for the deaths of almost 100,000 people, would you really want to know?
On the morning of September 11th, 19 Arabs boarded 4 commercial airliners at 3 different airports and crashed them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, with 0 military intervention. Or, we have been and continue to be lied to about the events of September 11th, and that elements within the United States government and mainstream media continue to cover up the truth. These are the same people that lied about weapons of mass destruction. They endorsed a lie that's killed several 100,000 innocent people overseas. Could they also endorse a lie that killed almost 3,000 innocent people in our own country? Our entire foreign and domestic policy has been based upon the events of September 11th. It has enabled the passage of Patriot Act 1 and 2, established the Department of Homeland Security, facilitated the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and used to pass the Military Commissions Act, which officially ended habeas corpus
Habeas corpus in Latin means you have the body. It's a provision in the law where no one can just scoop up someone, put them in a black hole and keep them there without that person having the right to appeal to a court and say, you have the body, now what do you charge this person with and what redress does he or she have?
As well as domestic surveillance, all in the name of fighting terrorism. And who ends up paying for all this? You do. Your children do.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a parent looking for the murder of my son. And you have to be a moron to think that 19 Arabs did it. Again, my dogs know better than that. So that's very important. Put yourself in my shoes and think of your child being murdered. And you've never had an investigation. Well, how would you feel if they refused to investigate the murder of your child?